Okay, Dado. So let's talk about your article that you just wrote about mindfulness and integrating it as a whole to Dharma practice.
Okay.
Okay. And so I read the article and I thought it was a continuation of what we talked about last time with,
Yeah.
yeah, with mindfulness in the conventional corporate sense and then also mindfulness in the dharmic sense. So it was a really good article that outlined what we discussed, and I felt like I learned more too by
Uh-huh.
reading it. Um, and I had a couple of questions.
Okay.
Um, and it might be helpful for the viewers too to explain how do you see mindfulness as practiced in the corporate sense?
Mindfulness is practice in the corporate sense is to make you present at what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a idea that people have used in the corporate world that's very beneficial for the workers and the corporations
Yeah.
uh, in general. It is a way to be focused, learn how to focus on what you are doing, basically,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that may be. So it helps the workers to be present in the activities they're engaged in, no matter what it is, whether it's making clothes or computer programming, learning how to be undistracted and unscattered.
Mm-hmm.
We talked in that article a little bit about the difference between being scattered and being distracted.
Mm-hmm.
Scattered or scatterbrained is when the energy in your mind is churning and going out. You're exploding with thoughts, scattered. So
Mm-hmm.
it's scattering. It's like a scattering of thoughts in every direction.
Mm-hmm.
Distraction, on the other hand, is external. You're being distracted by external things. It could be a bird, a dog, a person's voice, a attractive product, a car that goes by that you think is really beautiful. That's
Mm-hmm.
distraction. So it comes from outside and
Mm-hmm.
pulls you out,
Ah.
whereas scatteredness goes from inside out.
Ah, yeah, I never even saw the distinction there. I think people conflate the two terms or
Yeah,
they
they
don't even
do
think
often.
beyond it. Yeah, so we can see how mindfulness in the corporate practice, paying attention, attentiveness, you brought up that word a lot throughout your article.
Yes.
I can see how that can be really helpful for efficiency and clarity and getting the job done, like keeping your focus on hand. And I can see why employees or employers are really interested in the practice for their employees. And there's definitely a tremendous benefit in that. But in the article, you mentioned how mindfulness is not attentiveness in the dharmic sense. So do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, uh, they're different practices entirely. Broad its application is very different. For example, attentiveness is what makes you more efficient at your work. But mindfulness is a practice that does that in addition to helping you to be a completely happy person.
Pause you right there. So I think attentiveness is the beginning of mindfulness, like you said. And if you want a word for it in the dharmic sense, it might be shamatha or like concentration, focus practice where you're bringing your attention repeatedly back to the breath and not getting lost in the thoughts. So I believe they call it concentration or shamatha practice, which after over some time, after that repeated attention back to your breath, then you can start to um, then you start to delve into mindfulness and the insight and things like that can kind of unfold for you.
What you said is true. You have to keep in mind, however, that attentiveness, I mean, or even the mindfulness of breath, is taking place in a very broad based practice where
Yeah,
includes many other things that attentiveness, what I like to call attentiveness, which is basically corporate mindfulness.
right.
It's a word that I coined myself because it's very confusing for people because you see, they may not understand that they're not really practicing mindfulness because it's not in the context of an overall broad
Right.
lifestyle.
Right.
That's what
Right.
I brought out in the article. So the monk that's practicing what we're calling attentiveness now is actually practicing that attentiveness in a whole lifestyle that's completely different from a general corporate lifestyle or
Right.
different ambitions entirely for the practice. Like in a corporate setting, you're practicing it to be present at your job, whatever that is.
Yeah.
In a a Buddhist monk or a Hindu sannyasin, he's or a Theravada monk, he'd be practicing it within the context of many other practices.
Right.
So
It
it's
doesn't
just
stop there.
linked. It's a link in the chain of several practices that each support each other. These supporting practices are extremely important. I can't overemphasize that enough. It's just like to give you an analogy, um, the yoga, as it's defined in the Yoga Sutras, has 8 limbs. 8. Only one of them is asanas. That's what's being taught in yoga studios, asanas.
Mm-hmm.
You never hear a yoga studio being called an asana studio, but actually it's an asana studio because the other 7 limbs of yoga are ignored, which include diet, uh, morality, and keeping precepts and so forth, a whole lifestyle of disciplines,
Mm-hmm.
other 7 limbs. So when all of those 7 limbs, in addition to asana, are practiced, that is yoga.
Yeah.
In similar manner, when attentiveness, if you will, is practiced with all the other practices that go into a Buddhist life or a spiritual life, then that is mindfulness
Mm-hmm.
in the true sense. So that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really helpful to know. And that's why your title with the article was something about it's not an isolated practice, it's not the side dish. So
Yeah. Actually, yeah, it's not a side dish.
yeah,
And,
it's
and, and yeah, it's not a side dish.
not a side dish.
It's not the chutney. It's not the chutney.
Uh, so do you want to share a little bit about like the maybe if you will the other limbs of the dharmic practice that kind of facilitate with mindfulness, like there's kindness, compassion. Are you speaking about those qualities that are really important to develop
Yeah, but
alongside?
well, those qualities you just mentioned, kindness and compassion, sympathetic joy, which is rejoicing in the virtues and good fortune of others, feeling others' good fortune as your own good fortune rather than getting jealous or anything or wanting to be like them. Just think, wow, that's so great for them.
Hmm.
Uh, all of these qualities are basically uh, not developed. They're actually found inside you. You find them rather than develop them. Reflection, meditation, uh, morality, not taking intoxicants, sometimes the harmlessness, as Gandhi would call it, ahimsa, um, a generally understanding of the actual aim of the practice is to end suffering and attain bliss, the blissful nature of the mind.
Hmm.
So this itself is a facilitator
I
of
was
all
hoping you
the
would say that.
yeah, it's a facilitator of other practices. It helps you be more efficient at other practices, not so much that you want to be really good, because if you were really just focused on mindfulness, you can enter very blissful states and attain really uh, happy or very deep states of awareness and bliss out, but when you come out, you're just the same afflicted, attached person that you were when you went into that state. So there's dangers to mindfulness being practiced by itself that you avoid by putting it in the context of a broad-based practice.
Well, can I pause you right there? I'm just trying to see what's a helpful way of visual, kind of like painting a visual of how to see it, because on the one hand, you can see it as a practice as itself, but you also described it as a facilitator where it's like um, it's it's connected to all the other practices. Like you mentioned, the enzyme that
Yeah,
brings all the nutrients to the body.
yeah, Q10.
So what's a
Q,
helpful way to view it? Can you see it as a practice and maybe as a limb, or is it more helpful to see it as kind of maybe overarching and then there's the other limbs of
I
practice?
think it's best to see it just in the same way that asana is seen in yoga practice as something that fits in, that's a link in the chain of several other practices, probably 8 or 10 different practices. In Buddhism, they have the Eightfold Path, that's
Mhm.
right, right livelihood, right thought, right effort, right vigor, right concentration, right samadhi, and so forth. So mindfulness is one of them, one of the 8 limbs.
And they're all
So
interconnected too.
yeah, so interestingly, it seems yoga also has 8 limbs. Asana is one of the 8 limbs.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm.
all those limbs, they work together. And
Yeah.
any one limb that you just pluck out and you try and make it your practice, it won't work independent of the other limbs.
Yes. This.
So
Hmm.
yeah, so you have to get all the limbs working. So it's not that mindfulness or anything is any better. They each facilitate each other. So they're
Yes.
mutually supportive.
So this reminds me of another part in your article where you highlighted the danger of practicing it in the Dharmic sense in an isolated way, which is in the beginning, mindfulness can actually increase all of the afflictive emotions and the
Yeah, well, it
stress
does
and
that.
anxiety.
Yeah.
But it's actually it but actually so actually a more accurate way to maybe express it is that it may not increase it. It's just your awareness has evolved, so you're noticing it.
That's exactly right.
Maybe it was there all along, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea.
So I think it's the interesting part about, well, first of all, that's why it can be a dangerous practice in the dharmic sense if you're only practicing that and then all of a sudden you're aware of all your afflictions and then what do? You don't have the compassion or the kindness or the other qualities that might help you to work through those afflictions in the dharmic sense. But I also think it's kind of funny and ironic in the conventional sense because we are using mindfulness practice to alleviate stress and alleviate anxiety. And that's why people are interested in the practice in the conventional sense. But it can have the effect where you're going for relief, but you have increased your awareness. So you're actually maybe even more overwhelmed than when you began.
Yeah. Well, what typically happens, and it's a reason that most meditation practices fail, is because, like you said, it instead of getting rid of your afflictions, it just seems to make them increase. But of course, they're not really increasing. It's just your awareness of them is getting better. It's just like, for me, when I go to Costco and I forget my glasses, I don't see all the products I want, you know. When I put on my glasses, I see all of these things that I can use. So maybe I'm better off going without my glasses. So it's sort of like that with mindfulness. You wind up thinking, well, you're better off if you didn't practice mindfulness.
Yeah,
Uh, but it's always better to be aware of whatever illness you have than not, then you
right.
know what medicine to take.
Yeah.
But people don't know that, and they might just practice mindfulness on their own and not practice it with the other practices and they won't know what's going on.
That's exactly what happened to me. I got more into the practice after having Zoe, she's 4 now, but it was during postpartum and I was trying to find a way to alleviate stress, but I became more aware. And at first it
Yeah.
was overwhelming, but I'm glad that in, in, overall, I'm glad I stuck with it because I found that self-compassion and these other practices to really buffer everything that I was experiencing. And of course, you do want to be aware. You don't want to turn a blind eye to anything that's going on. So there is a lot of beauty in the practice, but it needs to be practiced correctly.
Yeah, and like you say, like if you keep your composure, like in the situation you just mentioned, being a new mom and everything and having a flood of thoughts about that, uh, then you realize, that life is about giving of yourself too, and generosity, and the most, uh, you know, raising a child is giving of yourself. It's
Hmm.
generosity, and
Hmm.
it's love and compassion. So people that raise families, they know that it's a way of developing compassion and patience, a lot of patience.
Hmm.
So it helps to develop a lot of good qualities. I think that it's important for people raising families that not to keep their practice and meditate, diligently. And as you know, I did all along when I was raising you guys.
Hmm.
So it can be done as in a family situation
Hmm.
effectively, very effectively.
Just bring it onto the path, as they say.
Yeah, you bring everything onto the path. One thing I can say about mindfulness in corporate mindfulness is that don't forget, most of the people that practice it in a corporation practice it at the corporation. They get the lessons in the corporation. When they go home, they forget it all. you know, it's it's kind of like something that they can do and they're getting paid for it, so why not do it? So the whole approach and everything is very different from a approach in the context of a spiritual life.
Mm,
So
yeah.
it cannot go as deep by any means.
Can you give an example of how mindfulness might be linked and practiced with another discipline in Buddhism?
Well, yeah, of course. What when you practice the Dharma, you're going to be practicing understanding the philosophical basis of the practice, what it's about, which is basically ending birth and death, getting off a cyclic existence.
Hmm.
Now, it sounds very, very far-fetched, that to anybody to get off of the wheel of birth and death. And we think, well, life is fine, and everything's going good. So what's the point? And so to make that commitment to end birth and death a reality, you've got to kind of think about what is really happening, what it is. And that has to become real to you. And that is a beginning goal, and it's a big goal, and it's a very tough goal to get even real. Think about it as real, think about it as important. So part of it is to study really boring and tedious books that, talk about a lot of things that we don't understand very well. And that takes mindfulness to
Hmm.
be unscattered and undistracted while we're studying.
Hmm.
So a good part of Buddhist practice or the spiritual life is actually, you know, learning how to ask the right questions, and then you have to recognize what the problem is. Most people don't even know what the problem is, let alone any answers. So uh, a good part of meditation is learning how to ask the right questions, not seek any answers. And so that requires study, and then study requires reflection after study. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says, I'd like to see my monks, reflect on what they read twice as much as they actually spend reading. So I witnessed this myself when I was living across from the Dalai Lama's temple in India, that the monks would often walk on the rooftop of the temple and they would read for like 5 minutes, and then you'd see them stop and while standing reflect on what they read, and then read again and then walk reflecting again about that.
Mhm.
So those procedures, if you're scattered and distracted, you cannot do those procedures very well.
Mhm.
So mindfulness practice augments that ability to study and reflect and absorb what you read and reflect upon.
Mhm.
So that's very important. And if you do that, then you you eventually become absorbed in the practice itself.
For people, because I'm sure people want to want to know what to do with all these afflictions, but oftentimes if you instead of going into that affliction, you have that time set aside for some sort of practice, and then that practice kind of takes over and you start enjoying that more. So it's helpful to have something.
Yeah, in Buddhism, it's called substitution of opposites. It's actually a technical term, and it's very common in the Theravada tradition that people with, have tendencies towards anger and hatred, the teacher might tell them to, donate his time to helping the poor, helping in a hospital. It's just substitution of opposites. So, so you just substitute opposites. If you know whatever, everybody has different problems. So whatever your problem is, you think, well, I'll substitute the opposite, and
Mm-hmm.
it works. It's just
Applying the
counterbalance.
antidote. Yeah, I think I've heard they say applying the antidote, and that goes for maybe thoughts and stuff too.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does.
Hmm. Well, I think that was I any last things that we want to express about mindfulness before we stop this recording?
Yeah, the only thing I would stress is that, there's this, if anybody who's set a bucket outside and during the rain uh, and watch the drips fall in, or even at a leaky faucet, they'll notice that a sink can fill up really fast, drop by drop. So I would say that uh, build a practice is the most important thing. Like, have a practice that you're going to do every day, and have a time that you do it and an amount of time you do it, and let it grow. Don't miss any days and make up any days that you don't do it. And don't put lay a trip on yourself that you have to do a half hour, an hour, anything. Find a baseline, experiment a little bit with it, and see how long you can sit comfortably, and practice meditation every day. Um,
Practice throughout the day wherever you go. It doesn't have to be limited to the cushion. Sense of mindfulness.
absence of mindfulness. So, so that's all I can say for now. But
Yeah, that was a great summary. I think it kind of brings home some of the points that we discussed earlier. So it's really helpful to kind of reiterate and kind of allow it to absorb a
okay,
little
good.
more.
I think it was fun. We should do this more often.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna stop the recording now, but you'll still be on here.